And thanks to both the Northeast and Southeast cast, both for funding this project and for inviting me to be part of this. I had this revelation today, the kind you have at a certain stage of life. It's a little confronting, and I realized I shouldn't accept talks anymore because the people that work for me, the postdocs, do all the work. And so I had this frantic meeting with Anna and Jamie this morning saying, wait, what did we do? And what am I supposed to talk about today? So I need to give credit to Anna, who was a former postdoc and now is at the Iowa Cooperative Research Unit, and Jamie, the current postdoc, who really did all this work. And so I'm sure I'm going to botch it up, and they'll correct it for me when we get to question and answers. So we, okay, so I like thinking about decision analysis. I like thinking about how we can combine tools from decision analysis with all of the science tools that we can develop to aid decision makers in making difficult decisions about natural resources. And this has a lot of components, right? It has these process tools, it has science tools, has these optimization tools. And there's a funny thing about how we've done natural resource decision making forever, up until sort of the last 15 years. And that is that we use observations of the past to predict the future. And that carries with it this hidden assumption of stationarity, that the system that we're managing will behave in the future like it did in the past. And okay, there can be stochastic dynamics, there can be fluctuations. We'd love to develop policies to deal with that kind of stuff. But we're fundamentally saying the equilibrium around which these fluctuations are occurring is constant, right? There is something about the behavior of the system that is stationary. And that in some ways is such a foundational assumption that we've never acknowledged, right? And it's exactly what's challenged by climate change or other forms of system change, whether that system change is driven by sort of land use change or changes in human dimensions, socioeconomics, or climate, or the interaction of all of these things. We know these are changes going on. And so the stationarity assumption is kind of out the door. So what do we do about that? Well, certainly I think really the work of the last 20 years, climate work in the last 20 years, has been looking at how we can understand the non-stationarity of our system. So like a lot of our science tools now are explicitly non-stationary. We're looking at the changes that are occurring as driven by climate change. But are we yet incorporating those into our decisions? We do scenario planning, we do robustness kind of stuff, we do a lot of stuff in a narrative way at least. Are we using formal decision analytical tools to think about what optimization looks like in a non-stationary environment? So that's the sort of interesting question I think that we're faced with as decision analysts looking at system change. So I want to do this talk today, sort of tell three little stories, or there's three parts to this story. I first want to talk about something that this is kind of a bait and switch. I didn't put this in the abstract, but I want to talk about managed relocation just briefly as a motivational setting for this topic. Then I'll talk about some work that Anna and I did on harvest theory and understanding time-dependent policies. And then I'll talk about the work that Anna, Jamie, and I are doing now with a lot of others. That's very much ongoing, and you're just getting a snippet of some emerging results, but it's really sort of work in progress. Okay, so let's talk about managed relocation. And I'll just tell you what the punchline of part one of this talk is that non-stationarity gives rise to time-dependent optimal policies, which I guess when I realized this seems obvious, but it was a revelation for me about a decade ago. So managed relocation, we call this by a lot of things: assisted migration, assisted colonization, assisted translocation. About 10 or 15 years ago, this was really sort of a hot topic that conservation biologists wanted to talk about, saying, okay, climate change is coming, what are we going to do? Oh, well, we could move species from places that are good now but are going to be bad to places that are bad now and they're going to be good. And there was a lot of philosophical controversy about that and a flurry of theoretical work about a decade ago, one of which I participated in this paper with Eve McDonald-Madden. And there has been a fair amount of application since. There's been some really very interesting applications of managed relocation in the last, particularly 5 years. But what what is the underlying issue with translocation? Well, I think the conceptual model, and this is the part of this particular paper with Eve that I like the best, was that if you want to argue for translocation, you're thinking something like this. You're thinking, okay, I've got carrying capacity for this species, whatever it is, in where it is now. Where in the habitat where it is now, there's carrying capacity. That carrying capacity is 100, right? But I think that that carrying capacity is going to decline, maybe to 0, maybe someplace else. I think it's going to decline. It's not going to be good habitat in the future because of your system change, or land use change, whatever. But I think there's someplace else, may not be great habitat now, but it might be good habitat in the future, or it will be good habitat in the future. So I think that if I move things from the source to the destination, I'll be doing a good thing for this species. I'll move them from a place where their habitat's going to disappear to a place where, even if it's not great now, it's going to be good later. Okay, so there's the non-stationarity, right? There's the non-stationarity of the system, that non-stationarity that's motivating to talk about managing relocation. So I've got a species it's bumping around, it's stochastic, there's time-dependent stuff going on. And then at some point I decide, okay, I'm gonna pick up all these frogs, I'm gonna move them, right? I know there's going to be some cost to that movement, like a whole bunch of them might die in the process. We try to get good at that, but we know whenever we do translocation, we lose a bunch of individuals. But then my hope is I'm going to put them in that new place and they're going to grow from there, right? They're going to recover from that loss and they'll grow up to the carrying capacity, but that may depend on the intrinsic growth rate in the destination. So there's an interesting question here, though, that gets embedded, and that is, well, when should I move them, right? There's an advantage to moving them early. Certainly you don't want to wait until the population's really low and move them. If you move them early, you get to move a lot of them. And so the losses, even though there's losses, you still have a lot that get translocated to the new location. But if I move them too early, I'm moving them into habitat that's no good, right? So there's fascinating temporal trade-offs about when do I take action. So this was sort of the revelation to me in thinking about this problem with Eva, a decade ago, was that this non-stationarity gives rise to time-dependent policies. And so we did this in an optimal framework, stochastic dynamic programming, yada, yada, did a bunch of scenarios and stuff like that. And this is on the left are 3 different scenarios of what the source might look like and what the destination might look like, different properties of those things. And on the right are optimal policies that tell you if it's a given time and the population size is a particular population size, should you leave them there in the source or should you move them to the destination? And what you see is these are time-dependent policies. If the losses aren't very big, you only lose 5% during the move, you basically wait, you keep them in this until basically those carrying capacities cross, and then you move them. These cross at different times. If there's a lot of losses, you might want to move them earlier if you've got enough of them, so you can bump up. Anyway, so the interesting thing is this gives rise to some very interesting time-dependent policies. Okay, so that's the message out of the managed relocation stuff from a decade ago was non-stationarity gives rise to time-dependent policies, and not just state-dependent policies. We now have to think about when do we take action? What kind of action do we take in thinking about time? Okay, so part 2. I want to talk about this now from the part I promised in the abstract was to talk about this from the standpoint of harvest management. And this was a paper that came out last year that Anna did as part of her postdoc with me. And so we're just looking at, this is harvest theory, it's done kind of in a pretend environment, but we want to begin to understand what are the properties of these kinds of time-dependent harvest policies in non-stationary environments. And the interesting thing is time-dependent optimal policies might be anticipatory. And that's very interesting to me. They don't have to be, but they might be. Okay, so let's build this up. So let's say you've got a hypothetical population, and let's just make this easy on ourselves, right? It's discrete logistic growth. This is a kind of little model that you're taught in an introductory population dynamics class, but it has, the properties of this explain an awful lot of the properties of more complicated models. You've got 2 parameters that govern dynamics, the growth rate R and the carrying capacity K. and you're harvesting this population with a harvest rate of H. Now, let's say we've got a population that's unharvested, carrying capacity of 300, growth rate of 0.3. Over time, it would grow in its logistic growth and stabilize up at its carrying capacity. Okay, so that's the pretend little population we're managing, and we want to harvest it. And let's say we want to harvest it from maximum yield. Okay, well, in the case where we have stationary population dynamics, where the carrying capacity is, say, in this previous graph, 300, carrying capacity is 300, and it stays that way. Maybe it fluctuates around because there's good years and bad years with weather, but the carrying capacity is staying stable over time. We can develop an optimal strategies, dynamic programming, optimization methods, and this optimal strategy looks like this. It's got one state variable, population size. Okay, so the state variable is on the y-axis, and this graph is showing what action you should take optimally as a function of population size. So if the population size is below about 100, no, the harvest rate is 0. You don't harvest. If it's above about 200, you go ahead and harvest at 25, 30% rate. And the switch point comes at about 150 animals. Now, curiously, that's MSY. It's not actually curious. It's a derived result. But so basically, this says you would like to be harvesting at about 15%, which is half our max, at the half the carrying capacity, which is 150. And that's the sweet spot to be. And this doesn't change over time. So the other axis here is time. We don't have, their time is not a factor in this strategy. We have the same optimal policy at all points in time because the dynamics don't change over time, right? So we have a time-independent policy. I'm just showing it as a time-dependent policy to make the point that it's not time-dependent, okay? That's what underlies all of, this is the theory that underlies all of our harvestment, whether it's ducks or deer or what have you, when we're making a stationary assumption. Now, what happens if I think that, or I know that the carrying capacity is going to change? The carrying capacity is going to decrease by 50%, or and it's going to do so in about 25 years, and it's going to take about a decade for that change to occur. So suppose I know this is sort of what's going to happen. I've got non-stationarity in the population dynamics. Let's put that into an optimal policy. You can do that. It's actually easier to do the time-dependent strategies than the time-independent strategies from a mathematical standpoint. But so the strategy now looks like this. Now this is interesting because it looks the same at the beginning, right? We don't harvest as the population's below about 125. We go all out and harvest at 25 or 30% if the population's below about 200. And the knife edge is occurring, the kind of the transition between 0 and 25% is occurring over a narrow band, right around maximum sustained yield. If I reduce carrying capacity by 50%, I'm also reducing the optimal equilibrium point, the point at which you achieve maximum sustained yield by 50%. So notice that now this switch point, this knife edge strategy, is occurring around 75 instead of 150 because I've reduced the carrying capacity in half. And so that makes sense, right? The switch point should be occurring at a different place. And this strategy is time dependent. What action I would take at a given population size is different early on than later on. If you got a population size of 125 at year 10, I close the season. A population size of 125 at year 40, it's a liberal season. I may allow for 25% harvest rate. And so, okay, so this makes sense. So we've got now a time-dependent strategy that's reflecting these non-stationary dynamics. You can't see it here. I'll show it in another graph. This is actually a little bit anticipatory. The optimization knows that the population carrying capacity is going to decline, and it reduces the population. It starts that extra harvest sooner to kind of bring that population down. So it's actually a little bit anticipatory. Okay, so this is showing a little bit more of these results. A couple different scenarios where you've got a sort of slow decline or a sharper decline, and you can see you've got these time-dependent strategies and how they move. And Anna's graph, that optimal equilibrium point, the half half the carrying capacity in the white dashed line. And what you can see here is, if you look at half the carrying capacity versus, which is where you would want to be, versus what the strategy is saying to do, there's a little bit of anticipatory thing. You're starting to do that extra harvest a few years early to bring the population down. You're kind of taking advantage of the extra productivity while it's there. Anyway, so that's kind of interesting and curious to have that anticipatory strategy. It doesn't last long. There's a little transitory piece, but it matters in the optimization. The other interesting question you can ask theoretically is like, well, what's the cost of being wrong? What happens if you just go along blithely assumptionarity when in fact it's not? Okay, so let's assume that the dynamics are non-stationary, right? Climate change is occurring, carrying capacity is dropping to 50% of what it was. But you're just assuming the dynamics in the past. So you have a stationary harvest policy, right, that you're applying. How do you go wrong? What happens? So, so if you simulate this stuff, what this is showing is with the carrying capacity declining by different magnitudes. So this is a carrying capacity decline of 0, no decline, to a carrying capacity decline to 50% of the original carrying capacity. And this is the population size that you get in simulation in the final year, if you're using a non-stationary policy, and as compared to what sort of half the MSY is. And so you can see that if you're using the correct strategy, if you're accounting for the time dependence, you've got a time-dependent strategy that understands the non-stationarity, you pretty much your ending population size is sort of matching what it should be, right? If you use a stationary policy when you should be using a non-stationary one, what happens is you fail to take advantage of that, and actually you're leaving the populations too high. You're wanting the population to stay up around 150 rather than go down to 75. So you're having a lower harvest rate than you should to kind of prop up that population size. What you're doing is you're missing harvest opportunity. And so you're not achieving your objectives as well. And that's kind of seen sort of where you end things up. If in fact it's not the carrying capacity that's declining, but it's the population growth rate that's declining, then you get a different pattern actually. What you end up doing is you end up over harvesting the population because you're not accounting for the change that's occurring in the growth rate. So anyway, the point is that there are costs to being wrong, at least in this little theoretical setting. But this little theoretical setting tells us a lot about and helps us understand a lot about what a more complex setting would be. So there's cost of being wrong. We could be over harvesting, we could be under harvesting. Either way, there's a problem, right? If we're over harvesting, we're not achieving our conservation objectives. If we're under harvesting, we're not achieving our utility objectives or hunter satisfaction objectives. So the interesting thing then is there isn't one answer though, right? I can't tell you if you're going to over harvest or under harvest because it depends. It depends on what is changing. If the growth rate is changing, maybe the population growth rate is changing because of climate change or land use or novel predators. Maybe the carrying capacity is changing because of climate change or disease or habitat loss. I don't know. It's going to be context specific. So the costs of being wrong will depend on sort of the details of how climate change or system change is playing out, and how not anticipating that change sort of affects the achievement of your objectives. Okay, so I guess this is largely, so two things, right? You could get anticipatory action, and second, there can be costs of being wrong, and so that motivates the desire to kind of look for look for non-stationary dynamics, and then think about how your management might change as a result. Okay, part 3, and this is the work that's very much ongoing, but so we want to take these concepts and we want to apply them to a real case study, waterfowl harvest management. And so this is ongoing applied work, and I'll try to emphasize what parts of this are relevant to the Northeast and Southeast US. I mean, want to be responsive to our funding bodies. And we designed, we thought about aspects of this project that would be relevant to the Eastern US, as well as others. Okay, so a little bit of background. For those that don't know, although I was completely intimidated to take a look at the list of participants today, because I know half of you and you all work in the waterfowl world. So the regulation, so for those that don't know, regulation of waterfowl harvest by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in conjunction with the flyways and state partners, as well as Canada. Fish and Wildlife Service sets regulations for each flyway, that harvest regulations for waterfowl. They've been using a formal decision analytic approach called adaptive harvest management since 1995. There's multiple objectives that are sort of embedded in an objective function. It accounts for a whole bunch of different kinds of uncertainty, particularly structural uncertainty, and it's adaptive. It's formally adaptive. There's a continuum of learning versus model weight updating. And there is there's formal optimization, the same kind of optimization I just showed you, which is called stochastic dynamic programming. That optimization in everything we do right now, still to this day, assumes system stationarity. It assumes that the dynamics of the future will be the same as the dynamics of the past. Okay, so in rough sketch, sort of for mid-continent, now I'm going to talk about mid-continent mallards here, which is the primary species that is used to set duck hunting frameworks for most other species. It's kind of used as a stand-in currently. The way we do it for mid-continent mallards is we have surveys that tell us the breeding population, the BPOP, the size of the mallard population, May or June. Those are aerial surveys that are flown. At the same time, we measured an index of habitat conditions called ponds. Ponds correlate really well with reproductive success. The more ponds, the more baby ducks in a given year. So from that information, we can predict the breeding success. We can predict the fall population size. A decision is made about what the harvest should be. There's some time lags in that decision that make this kind of complicated, but whatever. There's a decision about what the harvest strategy should be. The harvest strategy in conjunction with the BPOP and the ponds results in harvest in a given year, and that gives rise, and there's kind of more population dynamics we have embedded here, but that allows you to predict next year's BPOP. Next year's ponds also get predicted out of this. This is the kind of underlying model that we stick in the middle of this optimization to help us find the state-dependent policy that we think is optimal. This assumes stationarity. It assumes stationarity in the duck dynamics and assumes stationarity in the pond dynamics as well. And when we do this, we get this is the optimal policy, I think, for this year, right? It shows the Canadian ponds. That's a measure of habitat conditions, wetness in the prairies. On the y-axis, mallard population size. On the x-axis, anyway. And these panels have to do with what last year's regulations were. And then the colors are, whether it's a closed season, restrictive season, moderate season, or a liberal season. And so you've got sort of a three-dimensional three state variables here, and then that tells you, when you read into this kind of matrix, what the regulation should be. So for instance, if last year was a liberal season and there are 5 million ponds this year and 6 million mallards, that puts us right here. That says we should have a restrictive season. Okay. It has this knife edge quality, like those ones I was showing you before, where you switch over sharp range from restrictive to liberal seasons. There's a reason why there's all the closed seasons occur at a fixed level. I won't go into it. It's a constraint that we put on the system. So, underlying this is this kind of simple picture of a population model, that the number of ponds on the breeding grounds affects the productivity. That, in conjunction with the survival, which harvest rate, affect population growth, and that's the sort of underlying duck population dynamics model. Now, Xing Xiao did some work about 4 or 5 years ago, looking at how the distribution of ponds and the density of ponds in the prairie pothole region might change under climate change. Okay, So he did this analysis of ponds, temperature, and precipitation over the prairie pothole region using historic data. And then asked, well, what happens in the future if temperature increases by 4 degrees and precipitation by 10%, or if temperature just increases by 4 degrees and there's not a change? I'm not sure if this slide is right about what the scenarios were, but anyway, he looked at a couple different scenarios about how things might change, and then looked at how the pond distribution would change as a result. And so that's interesting, because if we can anticipate through climate models, Xing wasn't using climate models. He was saying, sort of what if climate scenarios, what would happen if these were what happened in the future, what would happen to the ponds, and then we can start to put that through the duck models and figure out how our strategies might change. So now essentially what we're adding is non-stationarity. If there's non-stationarity in climate, how does that affect ponds, and how does that induce non-stationarity in all the other dynamics that underlie this? So we're essentially saying if we take into account climate change, how might that change at least our pond model, if not our duck model? But in conjunction with the duck model, when the pond model changes, how does our harvest strategy change? Okay. So that's the question we want to look at, and we're going to look at it specifically for mid-continent mallards first, because that drives a lot of other things. And here's where we're at. Okay, this is very much in development. This is the work that Jamie and Anna and others are doing. So the plans are this: we want to use ensemble climate projections from the CMIT 6. We might as well, use the most updated stuff, right? So so one of my other postdocs, Ricky Burrell, has been pulling some of this data using Adapt West and this CMIT 6 data. We're going to look at 4 of the scenarios, these shared socioeconomic pathways that were run in CMIT 6. Those cover a range of different carbon forcing scenarios, as well as some other assumptions about some of the socioeconomic aspects. Okay, so with these 4 particular scenarios, you can see sort of a graph of carbon dioxide emissions, sort of forcing under these 4 scenarios over the next 80 years. I mean, those are really quite different, right? I mean, those are those really range from some optimistic scenarios where we kind of get emissions under control to ones where we just continue to let things get out of hand. Okay, so we want to take these 4 scenarios. We want to then, and this is kind of the work that we're in the middle of doing, take those 4 scenarios and with these climate projections, start to look at what that means for temperature and precipitation in the prairie pothole region, from which we can then use Xing's model to forecast pond changes over time as driven by these 4 climate scenarios. So we want to couple the climate scenarios to the sort of habitat models that Xing's done. That gets us to ponds. We embed that in the duck dynamics and the optimization. And we can start to look at time-dependent optimal harvest strategies that account for the non-stationarity in the climate. Okay, so we haven't done that yet. That's kind of about where we're at. I'm just going to show you a little bit of a feel for what's going to happen. This is some stuff that Jamie just did in the last few days. But imagine, just with some short-term scenarios, imagine you're looking at 2 scenarios, a positive scenario where precipitation increases a little bit and temperature goes down a little bit, and a negative scenario, negative for ducks or negative for ponds, where temperature goes up quite a lot over the next 40 years and precipitation goes down a little bit, right? This is sort of the drier scenario. This is the wetter scenario in terms of what it means for ponds. Put these kind of, this idea, I mean, this is not what's coming out of the climate models, but suppose it were. Suppose this is what you got out of the downscale climate models, put this through Xing's model, you get something that looks like this to say under the positive scenario, we get a little bit, we get not huge, but a marginal increase in the number of ponds. That's good for ducks. In the other one, we get a fairly, 50% loss of ponds in the prairie pothole region over, say, 20-year period. Okay, so we can take those, let's imagine we had those scenarios, we then put them into the optimization, okay, and Jamie's done that. Here's what the optimization looked like. This is a time-dependent optimization where you're saying, okay, as a function of how many ponds there are in a given year and what the BPOP is, this top graph is we expect that negative scenario, that the bottom row is if we expect a positive scenario. And here's the optimal strategies with closed, restrictive, moderate, and liberal seasons. You can't quite see the differences between those. So what Jamie's done now is subtract these from each other so you can see where the differences are. Of course, the positive and negative scenarios don't differ much from each other in year one, right? Because the dynamics are about the same. But by year 20, you start to get, it's basically right on that knife edge, right? It's where the changes are happening on the knife edge. And basically you're moving that knife edge to account for the difference in expected ponds, which means the difference in expected reproduction, which means a difference in expected equilibrium population size and carrying capacity. And so you're shifting your optimal strategy to account for those changes. And we've just begun to explore, don't look at this too closely because we don't fully understand it yet, but explore like if you simulate this, if you've got the negative scenario and you account for it, what's your cumulative harvest? If you don't account for it, if you just assume scenario, what's your cumulative harvest? These patterns are actually a little counterintuitive. I know why, but it's a long story here. We've got more work to do to sort of kind of work this out. This is all just sort of demonstrating what could be the case. What we're really going to do is use those climate forcing scenarios, predict the ponds from that, and then embed that in these models to get time-dependent strategies. Okay, that's one of the projects we've got going on. Well, that's the one that's sort of in the work. The second piece we're going to do, and this is just really in the talking stages yet, and we've got a meeting next month with the Harvest Management Working Group to talk a little bit about this as well as other things. We also want to look at another species in addition to mid-continent mallards, and I think what we're probably going to do is Atlantic population Canada geese. And in some ways, this is a nod to the North and Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers because this is sort of in their region. But it's also interesting because the harvest strategy for Atlantic population Canada geese, by the way, this is the population of Canada geese that migrates from the Ungava Peninsula down to the Chesapeake Bay. A really important resource, particularly in Maryland, harvest resource in Maryland. The Ungava dynamics are really fascinating and really strongly influenced by climate, and there are some strong climate signals. But the other thing about geese that's different from puddle ducks is that geese have this kind of age structure. They don't really become breeding until they're 3 or 4 years old, and so you've got this sort of population momentum built into their dynamics because of the age structure. And so our hypothesis that the anticipatory dynamics in an optimal strategy may be more marked in an age structured population. We'll see if that hypothesis holds true, but we want to look at that as a really sort of interesting possibility. And so we're thinking about doing that in Canada geese. So, okay, so, all right, so that's where we are. It's just, I know that third part of this talk is more a teaser and is not particularly satisfactory yet, but, we're in the middle of it and working on it and looking forward to seeing what arises. Okay, so by way of summary, what can I say here? So non-stationary and system dynamics, whether that non-stationarity is driven by climate change, land use change, socioeconomic change, human behavioral change, what have you. That non-stationary and system dynamics could give rise to time-dependent policy, context-specific, but it could, right? There can be anticipatory policies that anticipate that change. If you know it's coming, you might do something smart in advance. There can be costs of being wrong, right? Of not realizing, of blithely thinking you've got stationarity when there isn't. But the significance of these effects is context dependent. I don't think that there are going to be great rules of thumb. I mean, we're going to look for them, but I don't know if there's going to be great rules of thumb, or if we're just left to looking at this on a case-by-case basis. We'll see. Now, the most straightforward way, and the way I showed it you in that middle piece in part 2 with Anna's work, was to think of non-stationary as a shift from one equilibrium to another, right? In which case it's fascinating. What I showed you with Anna's work is that time dependence is really just a management policy, right? You're transitioning from sort of a stationary policy at time one and a stationary policy later on, and then there's this non-stationarity to the policy or time dependence to the policy in the middle. That's a much easier problem to solve than this sort of open question is, what if you don't know where the system's going? What if you see directional change, but you don't know where it's going to equilibrate? That, I think, is a much more challenging problem that we need to think more about. The theory, I think, on non-stationary and time-dependent policies is not complete yet. We don't know where anticipatory policies arise. We don't know when this matters, except for the moment in a case-by-case exploration. And so, I'm sort of interested in knowing whether we can extend the theory to try to understand more about when does it really matter to take account of these kinds of things. So, and let me just mention another project that's going on. We've got a Powell Center. Powell Center is kind of a USGS sort of think tank that funds small groups to think about hard problems. We've got a little Powell Center group. That's awesome group of people that's only met during the pandemic. We've only ever met virtually, and we're having a really productive time. We're trying to synthesize existing and emerging tools for accounting for non-stationary system dynamics and decision-making frameworks. We've got 3 case studies in migratory bird management. One of them is this one, the mid-continent mallards. The other ones are about habitat management, and then about, it's actually sort of eagles and wind development. Each of those case studies is led by a research scientist and a management partner, all from Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is partnership with the management agencies, co-production, all this kind of stuff. And we're exploring a lot of theoretical aspects there too. So more to come on that project as well. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. I won't give you email addresses. Who uses that anymore? If you want to get a hold of us, you can tweet us. If you don't like what you heard, you could unfollow me from Twitter, but definitely follow Anna and Jamie. Good stuff coming from them. So with that, I'll stop. I look forward to questions and comments that folks might have.